World Regions Geography 110, Part 3, Southeast Asia. So what you're seeing here is kind of a map of East Asia and Southeast Asia right here. And this was a thing called the domino theory. And what the domino theory was an American belief that if we didn't draw the line, communism would spread throughout Southeast Asia, and one country would fall right after the other. So that is why the U.S. ended up in Vietnam. And so I thought it was something important in American history, and it's also something that greatly impacted Southeast Asia in terms of migration, in terms of geopolitics, in terms of economics, and historical basis. So what it was basically, and it started with this Korean War and the Chinese communists coming into North Korea. When the North Koreans invaded the South, the Americans came, drove them back. MacArthur was here at the Yalu River, which is this border between China and Korea, and wanted to cross into China and finish off the Chinese. And instead, the Chinese came across by the hundreds of thousands and drove the Americans back down, and we settled into this truce at the 38th parallel, which kind of right across like that region right there. And at the time, the Americans said, well, if we don't do something, we have to stand here with nationalist China in Formosa and block the communists from coming over and invading. And that's kind of what this line is here. And then when the Civil War was going on here after the French fell and came out of Indochina, and this was divided into Laos, Cambodia, and North and South Vietnam, then the French withdrew in 1954, and American advisors came in and began in the 50s up into 1963, 64, and then the big buildup came in 1965 and 66, where basically the Americans went from a few advisors to hundreds of thousands of troops. So it just shows you the risk. And what the belief was that the communists, if we didn't stop them, they would just simply sweep in. They would take over Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Burma. They'd already taken Tibet. So there was some validity in looking at what was going on as to what would happen. It was the basis of U.S. policy in Asia regarding communism during the 50s all the way through the 70s. And it's responsible for the Vietnam War and U.S. responses to political situations on the global scene. So one of the results of that, now everybody's heard of the Vietnam War, and everybody knows that roughly 50,000 Americans died, and hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese were killed during the war. Now what you see here is a museum, and these are the skulls of people. And this is Pol Pot and the Cambodian genocide. Pol Pot was a leftist group. They took over Cambodia, overthrew the monarchy, and immediately set about purging anyone out of the country that they felt were a threat to their regime. And by purging, they simply walked them out in a rice paddy and killed them. They turned them into slave labor, worked some to death, and some they just simply murdered. Basically, anybody who lived in a city, anybody who could speak a foreign language, anybody who was educated was susceptible to being killed. And they call these fields the killing fields because starting in 1975 through 1979, when Vietnam finally invaded and drove Pol Pot out of power, Um, it was so bad that the Vietnam communists drove in, but they killed 25% of the population of the country. So 25% of the people were killed by their own countrymen. 25% of the population in 4 years. They were not stopped until Vietnam had invaded and drove them from power. Recently, they began some trials. We have some videos on that, some trials of officials, and you may see some historical information on that. It's pretty horrific, and it's just to demonstrate that man's inhumanity to man is boundless. So never assume that even people with good intentions won't do bad things. Conflict potential. Now this is an interesting map in that it kind of lights up a lot of different areas, and there's a lot of different things going on. So it's ethnic conflict that's going on through the region. Even though these are countries, there are a lot of different groups that make up these countries, and they're kind of bound together. More or less tribally in some of the regions. So, particularly in the hill regions, you have the Montagnards here in Vietnam. But we're going to start here with Burma because there's a lot of groups in Burma. You have the Shan group up here. You have the Karen, the Chin, the Kachin, and the Rohingya Muslims. The Rohingya Muslims are over here. This is Bangladesh over here. All of these groups are in various stages of rebellion against the government. And so there's a lot of political conflict, some potential for these countries to break into even smaller units. Thailand has its northern tribes up in this region right up here. Laos has the Hmong. The Hmong people, primarily located up here in China originally, were driven out of China and came down into these hills here and settled along here. They were U.S. allies during the war, and the Vietnamese hunted the Hmong pretty seriously once the communists took over, and the Hmong fled here into Laos. And you have in Cambodia, you have Vietnamese and Montagnard groups. These are hills tribes here, mostly animist in religion, not Buddhist. Vietnamese are more Buddhist in this region. Malaysia has Muslims, Chinese, Dayaks, and Khazar-Duzans. So in Malaysia, you have some Muslims here. This is South China, but you have Chinese also through this region. A lot of Chinese through this region, and these various groups are warring clashes with trans migrants. So these groups here are fighting with migrants coming in, trying to take their jobs. Does it sound familiar to our country? And then you have conflicts with ethnic Chinese and ethnic Indonesians in this. And then you have this region of East Timor. This is the island of Timor here, and this is Timor-Leste. And this region here has been under rebellion for 20 years from Indonesia. So, you know, it's not without. Now, in this region here, Iranese on Irian Jaya, this region up here, these are native peoples in here fighting. And then in the Philippines, you have the Moro Islamic rebels down here in Mindanao in this region, the Southern Islands. So there's a lot of potential for conflict and that's ongoing and probably will be going for many years. Now this is kind of an interesting thing. These are Buddhist floating temples. These are spirit houses, and they're a blend of animistic and Buddhist beliefs. And animistic just says basically that there is life forces in all of things around us. Native American culture was animalistic. You see a lot of Hmong culture. If you ever watched the movie Gran Torino, they have the priest. They're an animist, and they believe that there's life forces and everything around them. And these are houses that are built outside the house. This is a small house, and it's built on a pedestal. And the idea is that spirits can come and reside here, and then they won't haunt the people in the house. So it actually makes sense. But I think it was a pretty picture, and it was beautiful. It's a beautiful miniature house. It's kind of cool. Now there's some major language groups. There's Tibeto-Burmese. That's in this region right up in here. You have Tai Kadai. Excuse me, yeah. That's this region up here. No, wait a minute, it's this region right here, excuse me. This region right in here, the Tai Kadai there. And then but you also see some of these Tibeto-Burmese over here. Austroasiatic, that is the yellow group here. That's your Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, large part of Laos. And then you have the Malo-Polynesian, and that's all of the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, this region through here. And then you have Papuan. So these are a different ethnic group over here. So there's a lot of variation, and you see some isolated pockets up in here of some of these groups. So it's some interesting distribution on the linguistics of the region. Another big issue in Southeast Asia is HIV is a growing problem. So now the blue is where it's decreasing. But when we talk about decreasing, we're still talking about in Thailand 450,000 new cases. Indonesia, growing, increasing, not decreasing, 610,000. This is up 450,000, up 260,000, up 200,000. So it's a substantial increase. But what these two countries, this is where the problem is getting worse. This one is slowing growth. So even in areas where the disease is decreasing, where the growth is slowing, there's still a significant number of new cases. And here's some demographic trends. When you look at three major regions, Singapore, most affluent country, you see kind of a very similar population pyramid to what you would see in Europe. Balloon out, coming in, very low growth, barely replacement value, but you have this big wedge of population in here that's aging and probably is going to at some point create some issues in terms of political stability and decreased economic growth. Then you have Laos, which is a tremendously young population, very high birth rate, and very young population. And if you look, right there, majority of the population is less than 34 years old. And then you have Indonesia, kind of a more economically developed country, a little higher standard of living, but still a population that is the pyramid is starting to stabilize and maybe starting to drop, but it's still pretty broad through here. But you have a big distribution of ages, so you still have a lot of people that are going to be aging into this. It'll be a long time before this economy probably tops out. This one, you have a lot of young people and not that many old people, so it will continue to grow for probably another 20 to 30, 40 years.